We're pleased to be joined today by Jennifer Ryan, who's Assistant Commissioner for Strategic Initiatives and Climate Policy at the Mass Department of Fish and Game. She was formerly the Deputy Director of Advocacy at the Charles River Watershed Association, and prior to that, spent time working for the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife's Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program, and then moving on to serve in the role of Director of Legislative Affairs at Mass Audubon, and also as Policy Director at the Trustees of Reservations. So she has lengthy experience both inside and outside of state government. And today she'll be delivering a talk about developing biodiversity conservation goals for the Commonwealth. Take it away, Jen.
Great. Thank you very much, Rob. Thank you, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for joining me for lunch. And I'm very happy to be here today with you. Unfortunately, my co-presenter, Dr. Eve Schlüter, who is Deputy Director at MassWildlife, is unable to be here. She's not feeling very well and is disappointed to have to miss this presentation to our valued partners. So as Rob said, my name is Jen Ryan. I'm Assistant Commissioner at the Department of Fish and Game. And today I'm going to be talking about our work, our collective work to develop biodiversity conservation goals for the Commonwealth. This is an exciting effort that was kicked off by Governor Healey in September 2023 with Executive Order 618. And before I begin, I just want to say a big thank you to all of our partners, the many land trusts and state agencies that have participated in this team effort, and to let everyone know that we hope to have a final report later this spring. Okay, so I think it's helpful. Government is sort of big and Byzantine sometimes. I think it's helpful to start with a little orientation about the Department of Fish and Game and who we are. So our mission is to preserve the state's natural resources. That includes commercial and recreational marine and freshwater fisheries, wildlife, plants, and the habitats that support them. We work across the state and marine environment. And in addition to the land conservation and restoration and management programs, you all know, we run outdoor and wildlife education programs. We partner in schools. We provide technical assistance to communities on projects like dam removals to restore rivers and cranberry bogs. And we provide public access with over 300 public boat ramps statewide. We also implement the State Endangered Species Act and the Federal Endangered Species Act with our federal partners. Within the department is MassWildlife, where Eve Schlüter comes from, the Division of Marine Fisheries, the Office of Fish and Boating Access, and the Division of Ecological Restoration, who you all know well. I just want to say a big thank you to all of the divisions, and especially Deputy Director Schlüter, who can't be here, for their contributions to this effort. I also note that our Commissioner, Tom O'Shea, is a passionate advocate for biodiversity and is very pleased that this presentation is happening this afternoon. And he and part of our team are out in Western Mass right now, working with the governor on a culvert replacement project and initiative that both improves climate resiliency and biodiversity. The slides that you see are the product of our excellent communications director, Julia Hopkins. And a lot of this work was supported by our biodiversity working group with members across our divisions, as well as the public and our partners. It's a team effort. So today, I'm going to talk about Executive Order 618, how we view biodiversity and how we're thinking about biodiversity for this effort, go over our approach, including timeline and engagement, and then talk about the biodiversity conservation goals, which we have framed under Protect, Restore, Sustain, and Connect. We'll also talk a little bit about our thinking for Foundations for Success, and we'll have time for Q&A. I'll also pause when we get to the goals and see if there's any questions, and if there are, I can answer some of them, and then we can have more time for discussion at the end. All right, so Executive Order 618, and there is a photo of that auspicious day at MassWildlife back in September 2023 with the governor holding the executive order, Lieutenant Governor behind her, Commissioner O'Shea, the climate chief, the Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs, Rebecca Tepper, Mark Tisa, Director of MassWildlife, the Commissioner for DCR, Brian Arrico, and many others were there. It was a very, very exciting day, and I was happy to be there. That's actually before I came back to the state. I was there in my capacity as Charles River's Watershed Association's Deputy Director. So there were folks from across the board there at that event. So the signing of the executive order, which is the most sort of ambitious and comprehensive one in the nation, tasks the Department of Fish and Game to review all existing state efforts as they relate to biodiversity. So that's both within MassWildlife, the Division of Ecological Restoration, or the Department of Conservation and Recreation, as well as entities like MassDOT or Veterans Affairs. There's actually quite a bit that happens as it relates to biodiversity across the government writ large, which I'll talk a little bit about, and to come back to the governor with recommended goals and strategies for 2030, 2040, and 2050 to halt and reverse the loss of species and their habitats. And we are in that process now of reporting back up to the governor. We have a close to final report, and we do look forward to that being released later this spring. I just want to note that there's a lot of great work that's done in Massachusetts, which many of you have been engaged with, such as the Healthy Soils Plan, the Resilient Lands Initiative, the Clean Energy and Climate Plan, and our work supports and sort of aligns with and informs and is built on a lot of these ongoing efforts. So we really recognize the breadth of work that's been done in the Commonwealth, and we build from there, and we also very much appreciate it. We also echo Climate Chief Melissa Hopper's recommendations for a whole of government approach to the climate crisis. She calls out biodiversity conservation goals as a key strategy for adaptation. We recognize that protecting and restoring nature, we can build resilience to flooding, drought, rising seas, and extreme heat, as well as help species adapt to a changing climate. The work that we do under biodiversity also helps store and sequester carbon to meet the state's ambitious net zero emission goals. For example, salt marshes and salt marsh restoration projects can help store 10 times or more carbon than other ecosystems in Massachusetts. And restoring nature's resilience is cost-effective, impactful, and a win-win for people and nature. Every dollar spent on wetlands restoration results in more than $7 in flood reduction benefits. And in this context of all of this, we're also in the third most densely populated state, and we have an urgent need for affordable housing, clean energy, and critical infrastructure. And the recommendations that we provide are both around protecting sort of the big open spaces, as well as protecting and supporting biodiversity in the built environment. The question that we get asked, and we asked ourselves, because there's many ways that you can look at this, is what is biodiversity? Is it species richness and abundance? Is it nature? How do we talk about it, and how do we communicate about it? And the definition that we've been using recognizes that Massachusetts has an extraordinary variety and abundance of life, that it has inherent and intrinsic value, and that we have an obligation to conserve species and ecosystems, that it sustains us, it anchors our history and culture, sustains our health and well-being. It's part of our local food systems and economy and enriches our lives, be it fisheries or outdoor recreation. And it's also a climate solution, as I spoke before. By restoring nature's resilience, we can prepare communities for the impacts of climate change. And we also know that despite its critical value, it is in crisis, and we all hear the headlines, be it about birds or butterflies all over the world. And one indicator in our own state is that we have over 450 species that are listed on our state endangered species list, with hundreds more at risk. And to kick off the effort, when we sort of began our sort of public engagement, we put out to the public to write to us about what does nature mean to you? What does biodiversity mean to you? Why is this important? And this is something I'll talk about a couple times through this presentation. But we've had tremendous grassroots public response to this. Many people wrote us, several hundred people wrote us. People still check in, be it from sort of the small nature clubs to the big organizations. They're excited and enthusiastic about this report. And also, as we interviewed our colleagues in other agencies and spoke to the public, people were thrilled and just so excited that they had an opportunity to talk about why nature is important to them and how they think about it in relation to their work. And so these are some of the examples. And this is from our report. One of the ones that I particularly appreciate is just that I love and appreciate nature. It keeps me happy and grounded. So we have many of these, and they'll be up on our website. And we all know the threats to biodiversity. We're in the land conservation world, and land trusts know all of this well, that there's pollution of lands and waters and oceans, invasive species, habitat fragmentation and habitat loss, that climate change exacerbates threats, and that environmental justice is an issue that we are dealing with and need to deal with statewide, and that there are stark disparities in access to nature and its many benefits. And we're thinking about that as we draft these goals. Some basic stats that are, I think, useful to keep in mind is that 4,000 acres of net forest is converted each year. In Massachusetts, we've lost a third of our historic wetlands. 50% of our eelgrass beds in our coastal ecosystems have been lost since 1990. Over 2,000 river miles are impaired for aquatic health. 35,000 miles of roads, 3,000 plus dams, and 25,000 plus culverts fragment habitats and make communities less climate resilient. And by 27, with sea level rise, we may lose 70% of our salt marshes. Also, the Gulf of Maine is one of the fastest warming water bodies on Earth. And as sobering as all of that is, we know that we can make a difference. And when we work together, we do make a difference. When dams are removed, it's remarkable how quickly the river herring and other fish come back, and that the seed banks on those river shores are still there and that they grow again. We used to have no peregrine falcons. Now we have very, very successful pairs all through Massachusetts. You can see them in Boston, you can see them in Newburyport, you can see them elsewhere. The bald eagles have come back. We see them on the Mystic Lake, we see them on the Connecticut River. We are launching innovative programs to help support the critically endangered North Atlantic right whale. And we have a very successful Head Start program for turtles, which engages thousands and thousands of students. And so it's really, I think, very important to think that we can stop the loss of biodiversity, we can reverse it. There's a lot that we can do, and I know that's why we're all here in the land trust world as well, just knowing that these things do make a difference. And the birds, I think, as we have a slide here on the birds and talking about the number of billions of birds lost in North America, and the staggering numbers of species that are at risk of extinction. These are animals that speak to a wide swath of people. We all love being outside and seeing the birds, and we know that this is important, an important time for us. It's a call to action. That's why our governor has signed an executive order, and why there's an international effort to protect biodiversity. So this brings us to some more specifics under Governor Healey's Biodiversity Executive Order. So as I mentioned, our charge was to review all efforts across state government and to develop goals. We had a robust public engagement process, which I'll talk through. Then I'll talk through our proposed biodiversity goals under specific focus areas. And again, I'd like to thank everybody for all of their participation, the hundreds of people. I think we've spoke to 2,000 plus people across the state, as well as cities and towns, conservation commissions, and land trusts. Right, so this is where we are in the process. So last fall in 2023, the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife stood up a biodiversity working group with members of the different divisions. We worked with our partners and other state agencies, land trusts, and conservation organizations. We had a one-day biodiversity workshop last year around now for one for state agencies and one for partners. We have public listening sessions in July with public comment through August. And now we're in the phase of putting it all together and our draft report up to the governor. And we hope to release our report later this spring with a biodiversity initiative to engage people across the Commonwealth. And here are some specifics on the stats for our work in the past year. We interviewed the 11 secretariats to assess current efforts and opportunities. We held our biodiversity workshops. We did one-on-one meetings. We had an EEA survey, so that's the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. We surveyed all of our colleagues. We've given several public presentations, that's well over 12 now, to councils and commissions and conferences, as well as this. Our public listening sessions had 193 attend the first, 125 attend the second, with 60 plus verbal comments given in those sessions, as well as 200 individuals and organizations, conservation organizations, 20 plus municipalities, including the city of Boston, 9 faith-based public health organizations, 7 educators in schools and businesses, plus 300 pages of just individual written comments, very grassroots comments about what's important to people. I think it's helpful too to frame out some of the themes. We had themes that kind of came out from each of the different sort of areas of engagement, one within the secretariats, one within the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs agencies, and then public feedback. Increasing access to nature as important and something that can be integrated into the work of the secretariats came through in several of the interviews, especially around MassDOT and Veterans Affairs and Department of Ed, incorporating biodiversity into planning, design, and management. I'm going to think about that within the department, the Division of Capital Planning and Asset Management in schools, importance of nature-based climate solutions, be that right-sizing culverts, restoring floodplains, restoring salt marshes, or removing dams. Opportunities around workforce and economic development. We don't have enough of the workforce to do the restoration projects. We need to grow that. We need more people to be able to, for example, work in land protection as well. How can the state support those efforts? How do we think about biodiversity and grant funding criteria? And how do we think about biodiversity and water resources? So land and water resources are precious resources that the state has a vested interest in both protecting as well as utilizing. And how does biodiversity fit in? We had several great conversations around that. In the EEA agencies, developing biodiversity tools and land use planning, and especially around the upcoming state land use plan. Better collaboration between the agencies. Our sister agencies like the Department of Conservation and Recreation do great work, as does the Department of Agricultural Resources and others. How can we work more together? Sustaining farms and fisheries, education and engagement, what more can we do? And critically, supporting locally led initiatives. The state has one lens, how can we support local groups, especially ones that are in more urban areas and tribes? How do we get that information in and support those local efforts? And outdoor recreation as well. It's a tremendously important part of our economy. Public feedback, a real interest in nature positive, so doing better for nature, not just halting the loss of biodiversity, seeing better cross-agency collaboration, bringing urban programs around biodiversity to our cities and larger towns, and supporting municipalities, nonprofits, tribes, and landowners across the board. And then, of course, permitting and regulatory reform. So knowing that we have big, ambitious restoration goals, for example, around dam removal or culvert right sizing or wetlands restoration, how do we make it more effective and easier and streamlined to get those projects permitted and on the ground? And now I'm going to go into our biodiversity goals, which are again under protect, restore, sustain, and connect. And I'll just pause for a moment and say that several years ago, I was at an MLTC meeting when E.O. Wilson was the keynote speaker. I think it was E.O. Wilson and maybe Laura Johnson from Mass Audubon. And he spoke about his concept of half Earth. So what do we need to do? What are the goals that we need to set to protect the majority of species? And research under the concepts of island biogeography, or the sort of math around number of species, habitat size, and protected areas shows that if we protect half of the Earth, we protect the majority of the species. And that's a very sort of broad brush way to think about it, because there's also natural and working lands that are there. There's farms, there's forestry initiatives. There's a kind of a lot to think about with the use of land and land protection, but it's a very helpful, I think, framing to be thinking about what it is that we want to accomplish. And also, it's exciting to know that that comes from one of Massachusetts' own people. E.O. Wilson was here for many years and had a very, very productive career at Harvard and elsewhere. And it's a real spokesperson for the interconnectedness of life, as well as the ants and all the little things that make the world work. So our efforts do align with other state and international goals around protecting 30% of lands and waters by 2030. And for us, also under our Clean Energy and Climate Plan, we have 40% by 2050 as a goal. And so that helps us meet our greenhouse gas emission targets, as well as work towards climate resilience and protect biodiversity. And we are very excitingly at 28% of Massachusetts protected, and that's those big swaths of areas like the Quabbin that protects drinking water, down to sort of little local biodiversity hotspots. And by protecting habitat and providing habitat connectivity, by restoring species, by reducing environmental stressors like pesticides, by developing our educational system and our workforce, we believe we can get these goals done, which I'm going to talk through now. Okay. So we've been working on framing out what we think it takes to protect the most important habitats for species and climate resilience, to restore most important habitats for species and climate resilience, to sustain human health, food security, and economy, and to connect all people to nature, and to work towards a 2050 where people and nature thrive. And we're very, very excited. We've been working hard, our team's been working hard, as have our partners, to be at this point where we are pulling this all together to share back up to Governor Healey and then to take the next steps. This is an exciting time at the Department of Fish and Game. And so one of the, in addition to sort of how we think about biodiversity and the definition of biodiversity and how we think about nature and plants and animals, it's also important to be clear about what we mean by protect and restore. So protect means to permanently secure from future harm, development, pollution, and climate impacts. Examples include land conservation, regulatory protections, pollution control, and active management. And restore, transforming degraded habitats into healthy, resilient ones. Examples include invasive species removal, dam removal and culvert upgrades, salt marsh and eelgrass restoration, and continued management. And biodiversity conservation needs to happen at all scales. In Massachusetts, and we were fortunate to have some of the most the most important globally rare biodiversity hotspots, for example, in the Southeast, which the pitch pine scrub oak barrens and the insects and plants and animals that are associated with those, to our sort of regional landscape priorities like the Appalachian corridor and the Berkshires, to key habitats for rare and imperiled species like the salt marshes for the salt marsh sparrow. And then also, while we think about these bigger sort of initiatives that I think many of our conservation partners are very familiar with, it's incredibly important that we work on locally important biodiversity areas so that we're working at all scales, protecting the big down to the small, to people's backyards and streetscapes, all the way up to the large protected areas out in Western Mass or Central Mass or the Cape Cod National Seashore. So under protect, I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into these pillars or themes. Our protect goals nest within the Clean Energy and Climate Plan of 30% by 2030 and 40% by 2050. We built them out using biomap and other tools to identify a portion of these acres for biodiversity. It leaves space for farmland protection, recreation, and other efforts, which may also protect biodiversity, but have other values as well. And we also just note that this work will inform the forest reserves under forest and climate solutions. So we are proposing and working towards doubling the pace of land protection, strategically focusing efforts using biomap and protecting 425,000 new acres of important habitat. We've identified key wildlife migration corridors, many of which you'd be familiar with, and thinking about how we can do more. We are developing tools to protect locally important biodiversity. So in addition to the biomap local components through the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, how can we support even more hyper-local efforts, as well as tribes on pollinator gardens, pathways, and microhabitats? I won't talk too much about the marine piece, but we do have marine processes and goals about comprehensive mapping of essential marine habitats. We know a lot less about the marine environment than we do the terrestrial. And we have recommendations around pesticides, pollution, water quantity, and water quality. And those fall under rodenticide use, modern mosquito management, plastics and marine debris, combined sewer overflows, stormwater, and drought management. And land trusts are an important partner in this. As you know, land trusts help further local land protection projects as well as larger scale projects, communicate with folks on the ground in their areas, work on management, protection, and restoration, and are also key partners for Resilient Lands Initiative and the overarching Clean Energy and Climate Plan goals. Are there any questions thus far? Okay, keep going.
People should feel free to put questions in the chat as we go. And if you're having trouble with that, you could also use the raise hand feature and we'll keep an eye out for you. Thanks.
Thanks, Rob. Okay. Under goal to restore, so we know that efforts to protect species and habitats is one piece of it, but we need to restore habitats and have long-term stewardship and management. I think one of the numbers that really resonates with people through the public process is that Massachusetts has the one of the highest dams per stream mile in the United States, and that's in part because we're one of the first colonies. The first dam was built at the site of the Watertown Dam, on the Charles River. The majority of our dams are old, no longer serve a purpose. Not only are they a liability, and they're expensive to maintain or fix. 200 plus are high hazard and are at risk of failing, and they block fish and other wildlife from moving up and downstream, and they also decrease water quality. So there's a lot that can be done there, and those kinds of projects, especially the ones that bring the river herring back, are tremendous ways to engage with the public and are very, very exciting. And they're also a key cultural sort of icon for many of the tribes. The herring return is the start of the new year for many of the tribes in Massachusetts. So we have goals around restoring the most important habitats by 2050, significantly increasing the pace of dam removal, upgrading culverts for biodiversity and climate resilience, and restoring most important marine habitats. And I'll just say as a side note for marine habitats, we have a process that we're laying out, not specific goals at this point, a process for setting goals. And we do anticipate that there will be public process around specific habitat and restoration goals, both for upland and terrestrial, as well as marine, as part of the next phase of this initiative. And then land trust here, of course, work to protect sites and restore sites across the Commonwealth. They can be engaged with dam removal projects, especially around the communications, or if there are dams on site. Several land trusts have dams on site that they're interested in removing. There's also advocacy and showing leadership around dark skies projects, like reducing light pollution, or areas where we can have dark skies through regions and protecting the night sky, pollinator pathways and native plantings. The Arlington Land Trust has a lovely pollinator pathway, that pollinator garden that they've supported. In Arlington, there's many examples of that. And there's many examples across the Commonwealth, different ways that land trusts engaged, in addition to just land protection. I think there's a lot, hopefully there'll be a lot here within the Restore that resonates. And then under sustain is about sort of food and farm security and fisheries and access to wild foods. So supporting biodiversity friendly practices on farms and recognizing the support of no net loss of productive farmlands, finding ways to support urban farms and community gardens, restoring essential marine habitats, as well as salt marshes, which are nurseries for the fishes. For the fisheries, no net loss of shellfish. We're seeing shellfish beds close because of water pollution and water temperature issues. How can we address that? Supporting shoreside infrastructure and assuring equitable access to seafood and marine products. One of the programs that we are launching is called, the Department of Fish and Game is launching, is called Share the Catch, where we are working with commercial fishers and food banks to bring free locally caught fish and commercial fisheries meals to those that are in need, as well as expanding MassWildlife Hunters Share the Harvest, which is a very successful program where hunters donate venison, and that meat is processed and donated to food banks. It's many veterans that take advantage of this program. And then Connect. This is, these sorts of initiatives don't succeed unless everybody really has an opportunity to participate and to learn and be enthusiastic and be part of the effort. And as I spoke earlier, there's sort of larger land conservation goals and land protection goals, but there's also the importance of habitat quality and connectivity sort of across the Commonwealth writ large. And our recommendations under Nature in the Neighborhoods talks about that. So one of the projects that we'd like to further is the Municipal Biodiversity Toolkit, working with municipalities on biodiversity best practices, such as dark skies compliant lighting, stormwater best management practices, pesticide alternatives. and Nature in the School, in partnership with the Department of Ed and other programs to identify gaps in nature-based curriculum, to do more with nature-based preschools. The Department of Ed is already moving forward with that, and summer programming. And then Nature for All, so launching a movement for biodiversity, including increasing universal access for trails, developing transportation grant program for environmental field trips, biodiversity days, a biodiversity trail. We've had great conversations with the Mass Office of Travel and Tourism about how we can get people excited and sort of show them ways to engage with biodiversity across the Commonwealth. You may have seen the Department of Ag Resources ice cream trail that came out last summer, which was a big success. And maybe we can build on that as a biodiversity trail, bio blitzes, and signage. And how are we going to do this? What do we think the foundations of success are? And we have a number of different recommendations, and they fall under biodiversity workforce needs and assessment. So what are the trainings that are needed, and how can the Commonwealth support both working with students, for example, innovation career pathways in Chapter 74, so working within the high school and the VOTEC schools, as well as after school, youth empowerment and internships, funded internships within the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, opportunities for youth to learn and engage. Research and monitoring, how do we know if we're succeeding? We have a lot of monitoring that's already done in the state. What else do we need to do, and how do we coordinate with our agencies and track biodiversity metrics and communicate with the public? Supporting innovative technology and research capacity, including drone surveys and exploring use of tools like eDNA. And so eDNA is a tool to allow us to see if there's, for example, sturgeon or fish that are difficult to sample. You can kind of pick up their DNA signature in the water column, and it's much more effective than trying to find the individual fish. And then also incorporating traditional knowledge into these goals and efforts. And how do we do that? How do we engage Indigenous groups to incorporate traditional ecological knowledge and support tribes for their own efforts? And under governance and durability, partnership is key to this. Public-private partnerships to guide implementation, accelerate progress, drive funding, and sustain engagement. We're looking to our partner state, California, which began a 30 by 30 effort a number of years ago, and they have public-private partnerships that have been very successful. Coordination and tracking, so bringing together staff from the whole of government to have a working group to coordinate and track and share out our progress, and accelerating restoration and nature-based solutions. So this is tackling streamlined permitting processes and reimagining policies to reduce costs. So how can we move forward with dam removal projects or other types of projects more effectively? And then technical assistance and funding. How do we provide guidance and resources and support to help implement biodiversity goals? And that is my presentation. So thank you very much. I would just like to thank Energy and Environmental Affairs Secretary Rebecca Tepper for her support, Climate Chief Melissa Hoffer for her support, all of the staff that has participated to date, all of our partners. It's been a real team effort, and we are very excited to be moving forward with the final report. And so stay tuned for more in late spring. And we keep all of our public comment and other materials on our website, mass.gov/biodiversity. And with that, I will pause and just see if there's any questions for anybody. I'm happy to answer any question.
Thanks, Jen. I assume you can make the slides available to us.
Yes.
We'll send those around to folks who registered, along with a link to the recording, in a couple of days. So there's one question in the chat about just a comment, really encouraging you not to ignore career changers or encore career professionals. You know, as you think about workforce issues, folks who can contribute as volunteers.
Thank you. Yeah, that's important.
You know, in the workforce. There's another question just came in about, when working in early education space, what are the efforts to expand and reach these opportunities to communities that tend to have less capacity for travel, and the costs associated with participating in programs?
That's a good point. I'd say that efforts with the Department of Ed, sort of the cross-secretariat efforts, we anticipate that that type of work would begin after the final report. And so it's an important consideration to keep in mind.
Great. And somebody's asking whether you can direct them to dark skies programs or resources.
Yes, I can. I will put a link in. I'll follow up with that.
Okay.
Mhm.
The question comes as to whether there are permitting and regulatory advocacy campaigns around dark skies that you'd like to mention. Perhaps that's a follow-up as well.
Yeah, I mean, there is legislation within the State House, which people may be aware of. Also, we gave a presentation, Dr. Schlüter and I gave a presentation to MACC a couple of weeks ago, and some of the conservation commissioners spoke about including dark skies compliant lighting. So you can find dark skies compliant lighting online, and there are certain parameters around light pollution that can be included in local ordinances as it impacts wetland habitat for towns, if that's something that's of interest. And I know some towns are working towards that, and I can find more. I'm happy to share sort of more information.
Great. And if there are others on the call may want to put some resources in the chat if they are
Mm.
aware of any on that. I know some of you are working on dark sky stuff. A comment comes, well, one comment first, just that David Small shares that he hopes, looks forward to collaborating on the programs as this moves forward from Mount Grace. And here's a question. How many tax dollars are needed for this initiative? And is there a finances goal that citizens could help advocate for?
So that is part of. We are certainly have sort of recommendations around that, and that's part of the sort of working on the final report.
Yeah, I'm gonna put a link in myself here to a financing campaign, conservation finance campaign that many of us are working on. I just put a link to an action alert,
Yeah.
a new bill, the Nature for All bill that a number of conservation organizations are advocating for, that would bring a new dedicated source of financing for conservation initiatives, including ones that would advance these biodiversity goals. So I hope people will look into some of the bills that are pending right now.
Yeah. And
And
I said we appreciate those efforts.
it's going to take a lot,
Mhm.
obviously. I wonder if I could insert a question myself before going on to the next one in the chat, about to what extent. I noticed, you talked there about research and, monitoring being a component of this. And I'm wondering about just how specific uh, metrics will be around, some of the goal areas that you mentioned.
Mhm.
I know there's targets for specific, 2030, 2040. So is that going to get very granular in terms of metrics for, you know, biodiversity conservation? And I don't know if you could give an example. If so, if you could kind of offer an
Mhm.
example, even though the report isn't ready yet.
Yeah. Yeah. I would just add one more thing too on the funding piece, is that we anticipate an environmental bond during this legislative session, and that there are components of that that would support the biodiversity goals. And so stay tuned for that.
Mm,
And then on the specifics, there's certainly land protection goals, which everyone is familiar with, sort of the number of acres. Also, we would anticipate metrics around specific restoration activities. And some of that we also would hope to have, or we're sort of thinking through the process, but public input on specific habitat restoration goals or habitat management goals is to be part of the process, sort of starting maybe in the summer. Kind of depends. It's a little hard to say. There's a lot going on with the federal government, as everybody knows. So it's sort of a lot of sort of uncertainty in different pieces. But yes, we do. We will have specific metrics, and then also like number of communities that we are working with on different types of projects would be another.
hmm And so, metrics for kind of the process work of, you know, will there be metrics in terms of the actual, you know, biodiversity, the species diversity? Like you shared those really
Mhm.
striking data, for example, on bird population declines. So is there going to be metrics around trying to actually measure the biodiversity outcomes?
Yes, yes. In a like a smaller number of species, we hope to identify like a couple of key ones that we would be tracking. Like for example, you can see the picture of the piping plover that's up there on the left of the screen. That's a good example, or the turtle sort of down there in the middle, or numbers of acres of some of it's a proxy, like you're saying, Rob, like the acres of cranberry bogs that be restored, or number of bogs, or number of dams that would be removed.
Mm,
But then also the number of dams removed ties to, for example, the number of streams where herring can return to, and
mhm.
that has a count component to it.
So back to the chat. The chat is active. You mentioned action at the federal level, and somebody comments about given what's happening at on the federal level,
Mhm.
can we be assured that the state's plans can continue and accelerate uh, even with federal cuts that are going on?
I think the state's commitment has not changed to the sort of the core values, and certainly the departments within our we have a strategic plan that we are still very much committed to, that we've shared out. It's also on our website, and so I think if anything, it's there's a lot of uncertainty sort of across the board for everyone with what's going to happen or what is happening, but that has not changed the commitment to working through these recommendations and getting to a report and implementation.
Hmm. A similar question, as the one about dark skies came
Mm-hmm.
in around what advocacy and resources are available around rodenticides. I know there's legislation
Yeah,
pending on that as well.
there is legislation from the executive branch perspective. The Department of Agricultural Resources has begun an assessment on specifically second generation and anticoagulant rodenticides. And the Department of Fish and Game has played a role in shaping that assessment. That is ongoing, and we look for recommendations for that later in the year. MassWildlife, which is the division within the department that implements the Endangered Species Act and also has the role of protecting wildlife. Um, they're um, they encourage the use of alternatives and not the use of second generation anticoagulant rodenticides. There are public health concerns to be considered as well. Uh, and we do have recommendations on that. I mean, that is something that I would say we got a significant amount of public feedback on.
Mhm. And again, folks who are participating in this call may have some links to relevant resources and legislation on that
Mhm.
important issue. Um, Another question, integration of biodiversity goals into other state agencies focused on housing, transportation, and energy.
Mhm.
Um, is there, what are the prospects for that?
Sure.
Thinking about, for example, how there's sometimes limitations on the scope of MIPA review on certain projects.
Mhm. Yep. Excuse me. I can give a couple of sort of concrete examples of things that are happening now. For example, under the SMART program for solar incentives, there are biodiversity criteria that are integrated to shift incentives away from areas that are important for biodiversity to help encourage construction of solar on areas that are already developed or that are not so important for biodiversity. The new climate law, the update of the Energy Facilities Siting Board sort of structure and process, and the expansion of projects that would go through that process, calls out biodiversity standards in the statute. So it is we need to develop those. That law recently passed, and we'll be working towards that. The state is also working on the land use plan, sort of the there's different names for it, but sort of the land use and planning tool sort of writ large. The Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs is working on, I believe that's in the Clean Energy and Climate Plan as a recommendation. There would be biodiversity criteria that are there. And then working with MassDOT. Right now, they're working on a state transportation plan, looking at wildlife crossings and identifying spots for wildlife crossings. There's a big project out on I-90, and our team at MassWildlife worked closely with them, and we anticipate more an even closer working relationship on some of those projects. Those are a couple of ongoing examples, and then going forward, I'm sure that there'll be other opportunities.
Somebody asked, this is a good question around if you can speak to designating lands as wildlands, or forest reserves, for example, and how that would fit in to the overall plan.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So the forest.
It's the sort of active management versus, wildlands sort of question.
I think what I can say about that is that we anticipate the forest reserves process so later this year, and that there will be some natural overlap on areas that are important for biodiversity. They're also the most carbon rich forests, and we see some alignment there. And then on the management questions, MassWildlife is working or will be working on habitat management goals later this year. And then we are also thinking about what those sort of bigger picture goals are. I mentioned this earlier in the presentation, so I'm alluding to, like, what are the bigger picture goals for the Commonwealth? Because management is an important tool for biodiversity conservation.
There's a question about whether the plan addresses native fish in small streams, cold water streams, for example. Does the plan get down into levels of specific habitat types like that and the species that depend on them?
Not the that's again sort of for I think the next iteration of specifics, but we do recognize the importance of those habitat types. And the first round is more on the dam removal, culvert replacement, and protecting headwater streams.
Great. I'll note that there are a couple of resources that people have placed into the chat. Emily Myron put in a link to the Department of Fish and Game strategic plan, for example.
Oh, thank you.
So, question, I don't know if anybody can help, whether anybody has a link to the municipal biodiversity toolkit. I'm not familiar with a link to that, but if anybody else is, maybe they could place that in the chat.
We are working on one. There isn't one.
Oh, there isn't one. Okay.
Yeah. There are other jurisdictions have them, like British Columbia, I think San Francisco, LA. There's a number of communities that have them, and so that's what that's about.
Okay, great. Hillary King just comments that she loves the points about working with the Department of Education, and thinks she thinks you said something about working also with housing and Department of Transportation. Is there room for short-term goals that focus on education of and policy pointed at builders and developers? Their bottom line is so much different than the one discussed here.
Now that's an interesting idea. I will think about that. We hadn't discussed that, but that is it's a great suggestion. That kind of falls under some of the work with municipalities. I can see a role for that.
I think I got most things in the chat. If do folks have additional questions, or do they want to ask anything out loud? If so, you could raise your hand or perhaps unmute yourself. Great. I wonder, Jen, I'm just wondering if you have if the department has a vision for the release of the plan. Is there likely to be some kind of public event, or is it more of a press release and then we'll see a link to the plan?
I think we would hope for a public event. So stay tuned.
Okay. There's a lot of things.
For celebration. it's been a team effort. We've had we've really appreciated all of the support from our partners and all the great comments that have been contributed. So we hope to have a celebration.
Great. Well, we'll look forward to that. We were talking before the call about how spring can be an indefinite
I know.
time period. So I'm sure you can't tell us more about exactly when yet, but we will stay tuned.
We'll get the word out the minute we can.
Yeah. And there, just to comment in the chat that it's wonderful to hear you speaking about creating better linkages and sample language for municipalities, because that partnership is so key. Yeah.
And Henry has a question. Would you like to ask your question, Henry?
Yeah, that'd be nice. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
You know, one thing I've wondered about is the whole environmental justice thing. It seems it's just not as obvious as like, pollution or contamination or wetlands fill or whatever. What would be a good example? You're talking about a lack of access to nature. And what would be a good example, do you think, that you've encountered, and like what nature mean, like if you're an urban dweller, by definition, you're going to have less access to nature, and is that an environmental justice issue?
Yeah. It's I'll just mention quickly that our strategic plan is in the chat, and that has one of the pillars of that is around environmental justice. So it has many concrete actions that we are taking, and so that can be everything from translational services, so ensuring that we have information out about our public boat ramps and their availability in multiple languages. Or, for example, when we provided the public listening sessions, I think we translated to 7 different languages. So we had live translation, and this is being done across the Commonwealth. So it's that kind of access, as well as supporting efforts like BioBlitzes. One of the first things that I did when I came to the state was many years ago, before now I'm back at the state, was to help run a BioBlitz down on the Mystic River, and it was walking through with a bunch of school kids. It's before even the whole sort of Arsenal Yards development, walking through roadsides and sort of looking for what's there and sort of doing educational opportunities for people in different areas where there's not a lot of sort of natural open space. That's one of them. The Department of Conservation and Recreation, one of the ideas that we've talked about with them is free parks passes for 4th graders across the Commonwealth. So that is another way to think about it, but we have several different ways to approach it. I think it's a really kind of an exciting way to think about how to get nature to people and people to nature, and to sort of bring habitat connectivity into more urban areas as well, through things like working with municipalities on pollinator paths and pollinator gardens.
I think you're in some ways just addressing a comment in the chat that EJ, environmental justice issues are partly about how do we build nature back into our developed communities.
Yeah, it's a good way to say it.
There was a question here. Oh, well, I'm not exactly sure what Kate is getting at, and she's welcome to add if she'd like to, but just a comment about Indigenous rights for land access.
Yeah.
Do you see that there's a nexus between this and
Yes,
that issue?
Absolutely. So within, I'll speak to the Department of Fish and Game's role there, and there's a number of different ways. And so one is the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife has an America the Beautiful grant, and are working with the Mashpee Wampanoag to provide sort of skill building around habitat restoration, including prescribed fire, and then sharing of the sort of the MassWildlife perspective on prescribed fire and the Indigenous perspective on burns, and sort of a coming together and sort of developing a common understanding of that kind of activity. And then there's also access to shellfish and shellfish beds and shellfish harvest. through the Division of Marine Fisheries, and ensuring that there is very clear signage, and municipalities clear signage around herring harvest, for example. Tribes are able to harvest herring, whereas other folks might not be able to. So there are sort of several different examples that we work as our department with fisheries resources. And then also I'd mentioned Hunters Share the Harvest with donated venison, and a significant portion of those meals that are donated, they go to veterans, but many of those veterans are also tribal members. And so that's a big component of that program as well. Those are a couple of different examples.
You know, there's a comment related in the chat that the land conservation community could use more guidance about access for cultural use in relation to priority habitat specifically. You know, how do those two intersect?
Yeah. I think that's a good comment. When you think about harvesting cedar, for example, for indigenous uses, and that's an ongoing conversation within MassWildlife. And then another sort of thing I'll highlight, another sort of a conversation I'll highlight about that is we did reach out to and spoke to a few of the tribes, and there's more that we need to do and will do on that. But in our conversations with tribes and with organizations that work with tribes, the state can make recommendations, but also it's really important to support locally, sort of local initiatives and recommendations. So how can we support tribes to identify what's important to them and programs that they can implement?
And then, an interesting little dialogue about how it's possible to take small action, small scale actions to improve native habitat ecosystems, on even tiny plots of land.
Yeah.
And supplying native plants like pollinators on your balcony, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But then another comment that there is nonetheless a bigger picture land use question that we have to tackle about developing responsibly in order to sustain, pollinator pathways, for example, at scale.
Mm-hmm.
So interesting dialogue, I think.
Yeah.
So maybe time for one more question if anybody has one. Otherwise, something just popped in. Let's see. Just a thank you to the department and administration for the ambition, intelligence, and hard work that's gone into this effort. And yeah, it's great that the executive order was issued a couple years ago, and it's great to see this follow-up on it.
Yeah, thank you.
So, well, we'll look forward to getting out the slides and the recording in a couple of days. And thank you all for attending.
Thank you, everybody. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, Jen.
I appreciate the time.